Greetings from Dayton and Go Tell. I'm Amelia,
I'm Tom.
and we're here to tell you and talk about the resurrection story from the Gospel of Mark. So Tom will tell you the story.
So here we are, and this is the story. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and Joseph, and Salome, went and bought spices so that they might anoint his body. And getting up very early on the first day of the week, they went out to the tomb. As the sun was rising, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the door of the tomb?" But looking up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled back. Now it was a big stone. And going into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right hand, clothed in a white robe, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "Don't be terrified. You are looking for Jesus, Nazarene, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look at the place where they laid him. But you go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going before you into Galilee. There you'll see him, just as he said to you." But going out from the tomb, the women fled, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, that's the story.
Yep, that's the story, right? Anybody who would read this story would have a choice at the end. They wouldn't know, well, listening to it as you told it, one would not know that in, I guess, most of our Bibles, there's what's called the longer version. So the way you told it, the story stops with the women fleeing from the tomb and not saying anything to anybody. But there's a much longer version that goes on from there. And so I'm just think people might wonder, why did you stop where you did? It actually doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Right. Well, the reason is that the best manuscripts that we have from the ancient world all end at 1608. So Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, they end with 1608. And the conclusion of the great majority of text critics is that this is the ending that is most clearly attested by the best scripts. The longer ending, actually, there are two additional endings. There's a shorter ending, which is clearly later and is in a very relatively small number of manuscripts. And then there's a longer ending, and that one is often printed, sometimes both the longer ending and the shorter ending, in different translations. The longer ending is frequently included. It is it includes things such as that they held snakes, that they drank poison, and and those are clearly a reflection of later traditions that have no other attestation in the New or in any first century Christian documents. So the conclusion on internal evidence and on the textual evidence that 16:8 is the best reading. Then the puzzle has been, why would Mark have ended like this? And a majority of scholars have concluded that this was not the intended ending, though that number has been decreasing in recent years with further research into the possible meanings. And that's what I'm going to explore in this commentary, is that this was Mark's intended ending and that it fits with the styles and the ways in which Mark tells stories.
Okay, so before we even have gotten to the beginning of the story, we've established where the ending of the story should be.
That's right.
All right, so going back to the beginning, it's going to start with an introduction of 3 women. Although sometimes if you just hear it, it sounds like there's more than 3. It's kind of interesting. But in any case, who were these women?
Right.
Go ahead.
It's an interesting, the resurrection traditions are fascinating because they're all different. All 4 gospels have a different resurrection story. And there are different women, there are different angels or messengers. They say different things. And so the resurrection traditions have a higher degree of diversity than probably any other stories in the gospel tradition. And so when then we investigate that in terms of these women in Mark, there's a very interesting thing that happens in Mark. Mary, the mother Mary, has the longest description, place that this exists in the gospel traditions. Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph. Now, I actually misrepresented the story there because that double thing is only present in the burial story, in the description of Mary. And there are only one place where these words occur earlier in the gospel, and that's in the description of Jesus preaching in Nazareth and people being scandalized and saying, aren't his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, here with us? And so the connection is that these are allusions to this earlier story, and the implication is that this is Mary, his mother, who is watching, and is one of the women who is of these 3 women. Salome is not mentioned in the other gospels at all. That's absolutely distinctive to Mark. Mary Magdalene is present in all of the resurrection stories, and she's the only woman of who is in all 4 stories.
Yeah, but we have these 4 different stories that are quite different. Is there is one more correct than another? Is there a scholarly consensus like, no, Mark got it wrong, John had it right, or is there any kind of talk about that?
Yeah, well, we have no sources other than these 4 sources. There are other stories, but in terms of the canonical gospels, we don't have any independent information. And so the fact is, we don't know.
Well, why would they, why would the early Christians have included 4 different versions of what was clearly an important story, but didn't they feel like that might undermine their credibility?
Well, clearly they didn't. And that's one of the things that is interesting about this, is that we ask the historical questions, what is factually correct? They clearly were not as concerned about that, because they included these 4 stories, and the ones who composed the Gospels, and you remember that's some 40 to 60 years after the initial events, the there was no basis that they had for evaluating which of these was better and worse in terms of historical information.
Okay.
What I would say is that each of these stories in different ways renders different dimensions of the experience of the resurrection that was present for people in the first century,
Okay.
and in the period of the development of these stories.
Okay, so we have these 3 women. They buy spices, and then they get up really early in the morning after the Sabbath's over,
Right.
and go out as the sun was rising. And then they go out to the tomb. They're walking along, and they are discussing how they're going to roll this the stone away. And when you tell this story, you usually make a very big deal about how big the stone is. So it's kind of an interesting little detail that Mark says it was a big stone, and you usually put your arms way out. No, it was a big stone. Why do you do that?
Well, the reason is that Mark makes a big deal about it. It's clearly implied in the way in which it's structured. This is a very short sentence, we would call it, that concludes the preparation going into the tomb. So Mark makes it a big deal, and it is the setting then for what follows. The implication is that the women have concluded that something strange has happened.
Oh, because
they
right.
couldn't have rolled the stone back.
Right, they couldn't have rolled stone, so something happened.
Right.
So they go inside. They're already kind of
probably grave robbers or something.
Yeah.
That's what they would think.
Right.
But that's only implied.
Right.
There's nothing more said about it, and that's typical Mark storytelling, is to create puzzles that the audience is invited to try to figure out.
Right. So they're probably kind of nervous. They go in the tomb and they see this. Mark calls him a young man.
Right.
Who was a young man? You want to put quotes around it. And why is Mark kind of secretive, or not more straightforward about who this is?
Well, it's how Mark tells these stories. He creates mysteries and puzzles that the audience is invited to ponder and figure out. And in this case, the implication is that this is an angel clothed in a white robe, but he doesn't say it was an angel. Matthew later says there was an angel. John says there were 2 angels, and so does Luke. But in Luke's case, he says there were 2 men standing next to them, clothed in dazzling apparel. Well, that's a clue. But Mark is the story that invites the listeners to draw that conclusion for themselves. And so it is a dimension of their sharing the women's experience of the mystery of this. This young man sitting at the right hand, which was a position of power and authority. And that's the word that is, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. It was Jesus' confession to the chief priest. So the right hand is a place of authority. So he was sitting there, clearly a representative, a messenger from God. But you have to figure that out if you're listening.
This is about the right hand, and that being, a position of authority. sometimes that's been explained to me as like being that Jesus was um, that he was the right, the right hand man, right?
Yeah,
The right
yeah,
hand.
yeah.
And it reminds me of a time when I was doing this story in the jail with this, small group of women. And, I told the story and then we were talking about it some, and I was explaining the significance of this young man, um, clothed in white and seated at the right hand. And, how he was like God's right hand man. And so then later on, I asked the women if, they wanted to tell a story, and this, one of them did, which was pretty brave. They often are, nervous about doing that, especially in front of the whole group. They might tell it to each other. But anyway, she told the story. When she came to that part, she explained that, they went inside and there was a young man all dressed all in white and seated at the right. He was Jesus. He was God's right hand man. And we all kind of laughed. And she was sort of startled. She says, that's what's in the story. What I realized was a great example of oral tradition.
Yeah.
Because the story was new to her. She hadn't grown up. She hadn't been raised in the church. She hadn't heard it over again. What she heard, she put together my telling the story with then a little bit of description about it. And, to her, that was a story. So we were all very delighted with her wonderful interpretation. Yeah.
Right.
Good memory. Okay, moving on. This right-hand man tells the women that Jesus is not there because he has been, he's been raised, and the proof is that his body is not there. He's like, you see where they laid him, he's not there. So he says, Jesus has been raised. What is the significance of that?
Well, first of all, it is vindication of Jesus. The crucifixion and the way in which he died was, for people who heard this story, the initial communication for many people would have been he was illegitimate, that his way, his teaching the kingdom of God was invalid. You could blow it off because he allowed himself to be killed. And so he was not then a messianic figure as he claimed to be. So this is, first of all, a vindication of Jesus and of his authority, his status as the Messiah. It is also it is the naming of a great mystery that was part of the experience of people who were Jesus followers. And that is that they sensed Jesus' spirit alive and present with them. And so this word, he's been raised, is also a description of their experience, and is then a kind of answer to the puzzle that was present for everyone who would hear this story. Is it really feasible? Is it really possible that someone would have been raised from the dead? And the natural conclusion is, of course, there's no story told about anyone being crucified and then being raised from the dead. It's an absolutely distinctive story that one has to ask, who would have made this up? So something happened. And we frankly do not know exactly what happened. And there is an element of mystery to this, of what does the resurrection from the dead, the resurrection of Jesus' body, what does that mean? And people have pondered that for 2,000 years.
Well, another thing that I'd like you to talk about what it means is when the young man then says to the women, go tell, which, I mean, that's where we got the name of our ministry, Go Tell Communications. It's important, important, very short command, go and tell, go tell.
Right.
Disciples and Peter. And also why did he single out Peter? So 2 questions there.
Yeah. Well, he singled out Peter because Peter denied him 3 times. And so Peter was particularly afflicted in relation to his sense of guilt and of disappointment at himself. And I would say one other thing about what the resurrection meant. It meant Jesus was victorious over the powers of death, over the powers of evil. And it is a sign of his victory and of the transformation of all of the things that have been told throughout the story that are indications but remain mysteries. Well, those mysteries are significantly answered in relation to then this proclamation. He's been raised. He's vindicated. The mysteries earlier in the story are solved.
Okay, so now go tell.
Go tell is then the theme on which every one of the Gospels in one way or another concludes, which is what is going to be the response of those who hear the story. So the command to go and tell is then that the step after the realization of the resurrection is the commission, the divine commission to go and tell. And it was then what caused the expansion, development and expansion of the church, was that those who heard the story told it. And that was at the core of the proclamation, good news of the gospel, was that people told the story. So this ends with that issue.
Right, because
What
the
are you
women,
going to do?
because
Are
the
you
women
going to-
don't tell the story. The women
Right.
don't, with this ending, and they're very afraid. And so you wonder, why were they so afraid? They've had this good news told to them, but they're all afraid and they don't tell anybody anything.
Well, in the context in which Mark's story was told, which is in the immediate aftermath of the Jewish-Roman War, and in the aftermath of Neronian persecutions, when Christians were burned on crosses in Nero's gardens and were killed by fighting wild animals in the Circus Maximus. There were good reasons to be afraid to be identified with this story because of the degree of hostility that was being generated, that people had toward both this story, but toward the whole movement of Jesus' followers. And so there was real risk. And of course, in the ancient world, I mean, it's still the case that everyone is afraid to tell because they might forget, or they might be embarrassed or humiliated, or that they are not sure about whether they want to be associated with this story. But for women, especially in the ancient world, there was no expectation that a woman would ever tell a story in public. Women were not encouraged, they were not permitted to speak in public. So for the women to be commissioned and for them to be afraid was natural in the social context in which this story was initially told. So there's, I'd say, no great mystery about why they would have been afraid. They'd be afraid of the consequences.
Yeah.
And that's something that the listeners could immediately identify with. And so the story ends then with each listener having to answer the question, what are you going to do? Are you going to go and tell, or are you going to be quiet, afraid, not say anything to anybody about, your belief or probably wouldn't say anything if you were, if you didn't believe it. Uh, so,
Well, so is that why what you would think would be a very joyful story ends on a somewhat downer note?
yes,
Okay.
it is. And it is because it was the primary issue that faced then those who heard this story. And it was the primary issue that faced the storyteller, Mark. Uh, is anybody going to tell this story?
Mhm.
Is this going to generate anything? Or is this a story that will not be told because people are afraid? So in this case, it is the primary issue at the end of the story. And every one of the Gospels, in one way or another, deals with that issue of the Gospel. So in John, it is Jesus asking Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter had denied him because he was afraid of what the consequences would be if he identified himself publicly as a follower of Jesus. In the case of Luke, it is that he commissions them to be his witnesses throughout the world and then ascends into heaven. In Matthew, it is the Great Commission. Go and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and so on. So every one of the Gospels has this theme at the end of what are people going to do? What are listeners going to do in response to hearing this story?
And it makes me think that the story wasn't intended to be just good news for you that you would hear and be happy about. As too often today, it feels like our religion becomes, Christianity is very privatized. It's sort of just for personal joy, but there's an impetus here that the good news is for the community, it's for other people,
Right.
and perhaps even for other people that you don't like. So yeah, that's good. That's very good.
Yeah, it's a story of the victory of the powers of good, the powers of life,
Mhm.
the powers of love.
Mhm.
That power is powerful
Yeah.
than the powers of hate, of warfare, of hostility, and separation between people.
Mhm.
So it is a story of that is good news.
Yeah. And
People
hope
take
and
it seriously.
hopeful news, source of hope.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and if ever there were a story that y'all ought to learn it by heart and tell instead of just reading, this would be it. Kind of right there, go and tell.
Right.
So,
Right. And we decided on this as the name for Go Tell
yeah,
Communications.
yeah, yeah.
Story. So
All right. So God bless you all. Um, have a wonderful Easter.
Yeah.
Enjoy
Easter
the
season. Yep.
the hope of resurrection.
Right.